Many, many moons ago, I wrote, "A life without women is a life against women." And we see this on both sides. A life without men is a life against men. And this happens for all sorts of reasons, whether, men are so disheartened by women or they get so jaded by them that they cut them out of their lives. And we also may see it where men are dysfunctional in their lives, where they may want to have women, but they can't seem to make a good connection with them. They can't emotionally connect, sexually connect on levels that are human needs. The war of the sexes is dependent upon this dynamic. That if we are finding ourselves against men or women, and I know there's a lot of denial about this in the men's rights movement. They're like, oh no, I love women. But we want to put them in a box and control them and all this sort of stuff. It is dependent on cutting out certain aspects of femininity or masculinity to propel our own pissed offness, anger, hate, judgment, our own dysfunction, and ultimately our own pain. Well, that's what we're talking about on today's podcast. So one of my favorite things that I kind of wrote at one point in some weird manic Facebook insight, or I don't know if you could call it manic, but it says, a life without women. If you have a life without women, you'll develop a life against women. And so it's something that I've said over the years many, many times, but we do this all the time with the sexes. Like, a life without men is a life against men. A life without women is a life against women. And we see this most like when people break up with each other or they have damage from someone else. And I want to talk about the damage that is caused by the opposite sex to one another, because in some ways it is sometimes some of the most painful damage, not always. But if you look at women's lives, if you look at men's lives, the greatest amount of pain oftentimes comes from the opposite sex. It's also the most abstract, and it's the easiest to fuel with anger and judgment and disconnect and all these different things that come within us. And it's just such a terrible, toxic thing. Although it's justified, although it makes sense, although everything can back it up, although you can get tons of people to co-sign it, we are almost obsessed with living a life that is against the opposite sex. And there's whole cultures and communities about this. It's terrible. So way back when, I saw this, and when I originally wrote this, and originally kind of like started saying this like 8 years ago or so, but was from the pickup scene. Now you see it with the red pill scene and the MGTOW and all this men's rights stuff, and it was probably actually more than 8 years ago, but I would see these men obsessed with living a life that was without women, and their loneliness, their solitude, maybe their choices to be without women, maybe how women burned them, or maybe because they didn't clear up enough stuff in their life, they had lifestyles that did not invite women in it, or they used women or just objectified them. And there's a whole nuance within all of that. And this is like kind of the point to the interview series that I'm doing with a lot of different people, is that there are times and places for being angry. There are times and places for being MGTOW, so to speak. There are times and places of where you're sad and hurt. And none of those are necessarily bad. But how you handle those defines you as a human being. How you handle who you become, how you invest in your future with your thoughts today, absolutely have to do with how we hold that dynamic. And that was what inspired this original message. But before then and after then, you see the same thing with women. You see the same thing. And today's Father's Day, it's the 21st of June. And you see this culture of women saying, like, we don't need men. You see this culture of women saying that we don't need men to raise their kids. And this isn't the voice of every woman. This isn't even the voice of feminism in its entirety. But you see this happen and almost have a welcoming nest for people to express this thought. You see this thing of having a culture of where both sides are allowed to do this. And this is the opposite of what I believe we were born to do. I've always said, and especially when I was way more focused and still am focused on dating and sex and relationships, a man is incomplete without merging with the woman. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to define your relationship with people, whether that believes in monogamy or whatever, how you have your relationships. But what that means is that there's a side of you that is opposite, that will be incomplete without merging to the other. And when you merge to the other, it becomes a new thing, whether that's a new relationship, a new perspective. a new side of things. Maybe that's going back to the one of all things, no matter, or however you want to take it, is not super important. But what's important is that we don't have all the answers within ourselves. And again, if we're to be a group of people investing in who we are as a society, as a individual who's going to make something better, and we're going to invest in our future self and our future life, the one thing that we can control are our choices. And coming back to that is huge. So in some of the pre-interviews that I did with some of the women I'm talking about that has to do with like sex work, sex trafficking, hard issues like prostitution, hard issues like abuse, trauma, sexual trauma, and how women deal with that and how men deal with it differently, is one of the women said to me in one of the pre-interviews that the most damage that she ever received in her life was from men. But how that affected her and who it made her is a reflection of her problem and her ability to handle those things. Meaning that most likely, if you're active in your life, you're going to be affected terribly by the opposite sex. And you can protect yourself from that. You have that choice to do it. But more than likely, you're going to be massively affected by that opposite sex. And there's all sorts of different degrees. Maybe that's betrayal in a relationship, or maybe it's sexual assault. Maybe it's you get used or robbed in all these different ways. But it is your job to handle that pain, that anger, that confusion of all those different things. It is your job to invest in your future self, to take that into a spot where you can be a great man. And I hate to say it, but I don't know greatness that comes from hate, pain, judgment, anger. I know greatness that may have started there, but that was the beginning process of a great transition that you find in your life. And that's really what I think is so important. The answer for all of this, man, there's a lot. If you're a man, at some point, you have to learn to love and connect with women, even if they've hurt you. If you're a woman and you've been hurt and damaged by men, at some point, you have to come back to merging with the masculine. If I always get this like gay, heterosexual, straight, it doesn't matter. There's still two opposites that need to connect. And part of that side of us that is so important for, one, our identity as a man or a woman, our identity as a social being, needs to connect with things outside of us that are very different. And our greatest tool is that level of empathy of where we can feel and connect with other people and so on. I think it's a very, very important thing. You know, if we just sit on the topics of where feminism is right and wrong and get angry about it, we don't come up with a solution. If we just sit on topics of where men's rights or those different types of groups are right or wrong, we don't get to a solution. We can start there, but how do we invest in our future selves to get beyond that? In any case, if you like this, come by Austin Men's Development. Good stuff. We're on our Sunday call. Like I said, it's Father's Day. There's a bunch of PDFs and links down below, like especially if you're a guy going through a divorce, get that PDF. It's free. If you're somebody that wants a community that can communicate with other people and has like-minded people, check out Austin Men's Development. And if you want to dip your feet in the water, I think it's $10. $10 for 14 days where you can join the Rebuild Challenge, where you actually work with a community. You get multiple calls a week. You get a ton of coaching. You get a curriculum, private Facebook group, all that sort of good stuff. And it doesn't really matter where you start in your life. You can get some awesome, awesome help and service, which is what we do over here. In any case, have a good day. Live a great life, because you can. You can. Even when it sucks, you can. And that's one of your jobs as a human being, no matter where you're at. All right. Later.